How's it going, everybody? So today I wanted to talk about closing costs in a real estate transaction and how they relate to both buyers and sellers. So there's a few things to get to with closing costs. This is probably going to be a bit of a longer video, but I wanted to do it because it's one of the more, I think, confusing parts of buying a house, specifically for buyers, and even more specifically, if I can say that word, for first-time buyers, because it's not something that gets talked about until kind of the last moment. When people think about money and they get pre-approved and how much is a home going to cost and how much of a down payment do I need to put down for the mortgage, the closing cost discussion sometimes gets forgotten about a little bit. And sometimes when I'm working with lenders, they do explain closing costs to buyers, and sometimes they don't. So it kind of ends up on a realtor's plate to explain it. So closing costs in a nutshell are the costs you have to pay to close a real estate deal. And I have my handy spreadsheet here beside me because I'm going to go through, not in great detail, but just to give you an idea of what closing costs actually entail. So basically, the main part of it is your prepaid taxes. So when you're buying a home, the seller has prepaid a certain amount of those taxes, and you have to give some of that money back at closing. So it's prepaid taxes, and then the other things are lending fees. So some of them here, I'll just go through them. So you might have an application fee, that's for your mortgage, an appraisal fee, a lender loan processing fee, your attorney, you need an attorney too, by the way, your attorney fee, a title search fee, title insurance. You might have some points on your loan depending on what deal you have with your lender. The town recording fee, I'm only about halfway through, prepaid interest, and then you have to pay your insurance. You have to pay your full year of insurance for the first year. And then you get into little things that we call adjustments. So the most common one is if you're buying a home with oil heat, and on the day you close, say there's a full tank of oil. Well, you got to give that money back to the seller because you're going to move in and use the oil, and they've already paid for it. So you have to give them a certain amount back at closing. So that is pretty much all of them. Well, there's a few other ones in there, but that is the majority of them. So as you can guess, that really starts to build up after a while. It's hard to give a ballpark, but if you're buying a $300,000 house in this area, you're probably looking at 9 to 10,000, maybe 11,000 in closing costs. So that's a huge amount of money, and that's money you have to pay at closing. That doesn't get factored into your mortgage. You don't take a loan out, like you have to pay that money when you close. So that's why it's a hugely important part, and it often gets forgotten about. So that's what closing costs are. And then the second part is what you can do about it. And this is one of the most common ways that people use to offset their closing costs is they ask the seller for a closing credit. And this is where it gets even more confusing. But basically, you can ask the seller to pay a certain amount or all of your closing costs. Now, from the seller's point of view, if you're watching this and you're thinking about selling your home, closing costs are a little easier to deal with. Basically, you have to think of them if you get offered $300,000 for your home, but they also ask for a $5,000 closing credit. Well, they're basically offering you a net of $295. Because to you as a seller, you get that $300,000, but you also have to give $5 back at closing. It's all one transaction, so you just end up getting $295 for your home. So sometimes buyers kind of forget that. I always like to explain that, look, if you're looking for a closing credit, those two figures have to offset. It's not like the seller can just be like, okay, I'll pay your closing costs and we'll still agree on the amount we have for the house. They're two figures and they're offset. So another confusing part that people kind of misinterpret when it comes to closing costs is it's often used after an inspection. If you find a bunch of problems in the house, and instead of asking the seller to fix those problems, you can ask for a closing credit. So you find a bunch of like 6 or 7 different things in the home that need to be fixed, like the chimney needs to be fixed, there's a seal broken on the window, the dishwasher doesn't work, or something like that. So say they add up to about $2,000. So in lieu of getting the seller to fix that, you can ask them to credit you $2,000 at closing because of the issues you found in the house. Now the confusing part is that does not go to those fixes that you found. That is just a figure that is offset against your closing costs. So to go back to that example, if your closing costs are $9,000, you find $2,000 worth of repairs in the house that the seller agrees to give back to you. Those two figures are just offset. So $9,000, $2,000, you end up paying $7,000 in closing costs. You move into your home, you don't have then that $2,000 check to go and make all those repairs in your house. That never happens. You might have a whole bunch of problems in your house when you move in, and the sellers acknowledged it, and they've agreed to pay you for it. You don't get that money to make those repairs. It's just offset against your closing costs, excuse me. So that's one kind of confusing part to it, and I often think about this industry in general. It should be labeled, or it should be explained in a different way, because I can totally see why buyers confuse that. So the other slightly confusing parts when it comes to closing credit is there's a certain amount that you can ask for depending on your loan. So if you go, the two majority around here are conventional and FHA, and then CHFA, but FHA and CHFA are the same. You could ask for 3% of the sales price of the house towards your closing credit. So if you take that $300,000 house, if you're getting a conventional mortgage, you can only ask for $9,000 of a closing credit. If you're going FHA, you can ask for $18,000, which more than likely is going to cover it all. But that's another point I want to bring up. So if you are going FHA and you do ask for 6% and it's $18,000, say you do that. Say you ask for $18,000 closing credit, and your actual costs are only $10,000. You don't then get that $8,000. You just get all your closing costs paid for. And again, if you were going to offer $300,000, but then you wanted your closing costs paid, so you offered $318,000, but you only get 10 back, you've kind of given away $8,000. So there's a lot to think about when it comes to closing costs, and to make it even more confusing, I'm nearly up to 7 minutes. I don't know who's going to watch the end of this, but hopefully you got here. An even more confusing part is that those closing costs are just an estimate. So when you go in and make an offer on that home, and your lender or your real estate agent will give you an estimate of what they're going to be, well, they are subject to change. And let me tell you, they do change. Same with the closing date. Closing date and closing costs can awfully change. They shouldn't change dramatically, but it could be a couple of $100 here and a couple of $100 there. So it's a difficult one to manage. That said, people do it all the time. And like the theme of so many of my videos, you need money on hand to buy a home. It's an expensive process. So that's it. That's about as short as I could do on closing costs. I could probably go into it for another 20 minutes, but I do feel it's a really important part to educate people on buying a home. So to recap, your closing costs are involved in every real estate transaction when you're buying. And if you're going cash, they're going to be less, but you're still going to have closing costs. So they're in every real estate transaction. The majority of them are your prepaid taxes and your lending fees. You pay them at closing. They have to be paid before you close the deal. You can offset some of that cost by asking the seller to pay some of your closing costs. That does not, even if it's because of problems in the house, that doesn't give you money to go and repair those problems. Your closing costs are limited by the mortgage that you go for. 3% of the sales price for a conventional, 6% of a sales price for an FHA. And if you overestimate your closing costs, you do not get that money back at closing. And the final point is, it's always an estimate right up until the day of closing. I can tell you from buying my house, the closing cost figure did actually change the day before. Nothing drastic, but it did change a little bit. So that's it. I made it in under 10 minutes, not too bad. So I hope this was helpful for somebody. It's a confusing topic. It might take a couple of watches, or obviously feel free to just send me a message, give me a call, and I'll go over it with you. But it's something to educate yourself on, especially if you're thinking about buying a home and it's your first home. It's really good to sort of know what you're getting into. All right, so I really appreciate anybody who's made it all 9 minutes to the end of this video. Thank you for watching, and if you have any questions, feel free to let me know. Thanks.